Welcome to another episode of Nurah Speaks, and I am your host, Nurah Muhammad. I'm so glad to be back with you for another episode of the podcast. And it is just my goal to simply inform our community, to be someone to provide information, possibly some inspiration, and hopefully direction so that we can improve the outcomes in our community, whether that's related to our education, our safety, our health. I mean, I think that we can do a brief survey of our community and just see many areas that could do for improvement. And I am just a sister sharing information that some may not know, some may know, but need reminding, and just trying to contribute to a positive discourse in the world that often has a lot of negative or demeaning or conflicting and confusing information. I'm just your sister trying to provide a very clear and concise message. And this episode 278 is a continuation of the series, Know Your Numbers. And this particular episode, we're talking about blood pressure. Blood pressure is something that is often, or high blood pressure rather, something that's often referred to as a silent killer. Because when we have high blood pressure, we may not know it. Often there are no symptoms. There's not, a pain in the back, right? Or sometimes people do have headaches when they have high blood pressure, but a good amount of people just don't have obvious symptoms, like you know, a lethargy, mm, mouth dryness or frequent urination. There are no real obvious symptoms, and so people can be afflicted with that and have that and not know it for many years until they're faced with a medical crisis. And so just an understanding what blood pressure is simply the force that blood is flowing through our bodies, particularly our arteries, when our heart beats and when our heart is at rest. And so when we are at the doctor or perhaps using an at home blood pressure monitor, the systolic number, which is the top number, that number measures the pressure in our arteries when our heart beats. And the diastolic number, the number on the bottom, that is a measurement of the pressure of the blood in our arteries when our hearts are at rest. It's the period between the beats. So we have our systolic and we have our diastolic. And the only way for us to know our numbers is for our doctor to take our blood pressure or for us to monitor our blood pressure with an at home monitor. And there are many kinds that you can buy over the counter. There are some that you can use on the wrist. In fact, I have a doctor, a dentist, as a matter of fact, and every patient that comes in, she takes the blood pressure, and there's a wrist monitor. And you can also get a blood pressure cuff, a digital cuff that you can use to take your blood pressure on your arm. Understand that the cuff that goes on the arm is more accurate than the cuff that is on the wrist, but whatever you can afford and whatever you can get as soon as possible is ideal. And I would encourage you to follow the manufacturer's directions because these cuffs come with instructions because there's a certain way that the cuff has to be applied. There's a certain way that we have to sit, right? Not having our feet crossed, our legs crossed. If we're using a cuff on the arm, then, there's a certain placement relative to the heart. So make sure when you get your cuff or if you have it, you're following the manufacturer's instructions so that when you do take your blood pressure and you're monitoring it, you're getting the most accurate reading. And I'll also say that, many people have something called white coat syndrome. And that is an anxiety, I guess, when we're at the doctor's and there's some nervousness there. And so sometimes our blood pressure can be high at the doctor's, higher at the doctor's than it is if we are taking it at home. And that happens. I remember once I went to a doctor and I was running late and I was rushing and I had hoped that I would have some time in the waiting room before I was called back and I didn't have as much time as I'd like. So when the nurse took my blood pressure, it was a little high and I asked her if she could take it again before I left. because I'm very concerned about maintaining a healthy blood pressure. That's always been important to me. And so when at the conclusion of the visit, she took it again and it was normal. So even if it is high when you go in and you would like the doctor to take it again, or the nurse or the tech, they can do that for you. I remember once when I was probably about 18 or 19, I was at my family doctor, and there was a young lady who was a student. And when she went to take my blood pressure, she was having real challenges. And she said, "Well, what is your blood pressure normally?" And I knew what my blood pressure was normally, but I always want an accurate assessment, even at that young age in my late teens. And she was just having trouble. And I was just trying to encourage her to take her time. And ultimately, the nurse that worked for the facility did come in and take my blood pressure. So, but that was a moment where I could have just said, "Well, it's usually, 120 over 60." But don't ever feel uncomfortable about making sure you're getting your numbers, regardless if you want it checked a second time before you leave the office, if you think that the initial reading was somehow inaccurate. Always make sure that you advocate for yourself to get those numbers. So it's important for us to know what our numbers mean, right? So when we do get the numbers, we know whether our blood pressure is in a healthy range or not. And so a healthy range of blood pressure is about 120 over 80. And that's when the top number is 120, the bottom number is 80. So our systolic is 120 and our diastolic is 80. And that around there is a healthy range. I've seen my blood pressure like 115 over 75. But I know if it's over 120 or 120 over 80, then I am very, very concerned. And fortunately, that's not something I have to deal with. But it's because I've made life decisions. I remember growing up and watching family members be concerned about blood pressure, taking blood pressure medication. And so I don't want that to be me. And so it's always been something that I had concerned of, and especially knowing a family history. And this is why knowing our numbers and knowing, the medical history of our family is so important. And I know that some things can quote run in families, but I also know habits run in families. So I wanted to have the habits that didn't contribute to high blood pressure. So 120 over 80 is normal. A blood pressure of 130 over 80 is hypertension. And hypertension is something that it can be managed, it can be brought down, but blood pressure is such an important value, and it's something that we want to have control over, meaning having the ability to keep our blood pressure at a healthy range, because the impacts and implications of high blood pressure can be life changing and, in fact, deadly, and not life changing in a good way. So, high blood pressure, also known as hypertension, as I mentioned, there's no real obvious symptoms, and that's why it is called the silent killer. And, the force that our heart is going to require to pump blood is impacted by our blood pressure, right? And having a high blood pressure puts extra strain on our heart and on the muscles of our heart and on our blood vessels. And when our arteries are damaged from high blood pressure, that force, if you just think of like tubing, right? And you think about something coming through the tubing at a very high force. If you think about your garden hose, right? And the force of our vessels, the construction of our blood vessels, not made of the same material of our garden hose, and it is not indestructible. And so, if we continue to allow a, a strong force on our arteries, on our vessels, they will become damaged and they will become less flexible, and they'll become more prone to blockages. And some of the life threatening complications are strokes. And we may have known, or we may know people who have had strokes, and that can be a devastating health crisis that can lead to paralysis, that can change what was seemingly a healthy lifestyle in a healthy body to someone not being able to use parts of their body, perhaps having real severe brain damage from a stroke when parts of our brain is not getting blood flow to it. And remember, every part of our body has blood vessels, every part, right? So if the pressure within our arteries are being impacted, it's not just a cardiac issue. It's not just a brain issue. Think about your kidneys, think about our liver, think about our pancreas. And in fact, an early warning sign for men with high blood pressure is erectile dysfunction, right? Because our blood vessels are not are being impacted, and you know some of these meds that men take for erectile dysfunction, it opens up and allows adequate blood flow, right? And so if your husband is dealing with this issue, you should have your husband go to the doctor and get a checkup because his blood pressure may be high. And there are, you know, real simple and healthy lifestyle changes that we can make to manage our blood pressure, to bring our blood pressure down without the use of medications. However, if you are on medications, then, you should desire to make those appropriate changes so that you can reduce your blood pressure and ultimately come off the medications, because medications also have adverse implications on our bodies as well. And so it is not the goal that we live forever on medications, although as a temporary measure, they can be helpful. So I encourage everybody to work with their practitioners, work with their doctors, their nurse practitioners, their clinicians, so that you can manage your blood pressure when it is high. And I'll say, as you go to the doctor and your doctor is performing your annual physicals, and we should be going to the doctor, having our annual physicals, then your doctor can kind of track you over years and to see what your baseline is. If your blood pressure is suddenly high, the doc can say, well, what's going on in your life? And it just might be stress, right? It might not be necessarily a dietary change. It could be stress that's contributing to high blood pressure. However, you want to have your doctor have the ability, especially if it's a good doctor, to be able to track your blood pressure over years. And hopefully you have a relationship with your doctor, and you might have decades worth of health information in your file that your doctor can reference. So go to the doctor, schedule your physicals. You may say, Nora, I don't have insurance. I don't have a primary care doctor. There are medical institutions that offer free screenings, especially of blood sugar, especially of cholesterol, and especially of blood pressure, but especially blood pressure and blood sugar. Health fairs, right? Your local municipality may have a health fair where there's free blood pressure monitoring. There are some medical institutions in your local area that might have programs where you can have your blood pressure monitored. And in fact, I met a very nice woman who works in my community in one of the hospitals and health systems that are local. And she was telling me about a program for people who have high blood pressure where they can join and be part of a work group where they can have their blood pressure taken. They will get nutrition and dietary counseling, and they are checked on a very frequent basis. I believe she said monthly. So take advantage of some programs in your community. If you say, well, I don't have insurance, I won't be able to get my blood pressure taken by a doctor. And I will also say, some doctors have reduced rates for people who don't have insurance. Some practices have reduced rates for people who don't have medical insurance. So don't use not having medical insurance, health insurance as a barrier or as an excuse not to. And as I say, we can also invest ourselves by buying blood pressure monitoring kits, blood sugar monitoring kits to have in our homes. So how, if our blood pressure is high, how can we improve our blood pressure? Well, first, we have to think about sodium and our salt intake and how much salt are we consuming daily. And the American Medical Association recommends 2,300 milligrams of sodium a day, right? Salt is a mineral. It's a naturally occurring mineral, and we add it to foods to, one, enhance the taste, but also salt is added to foods or some salt-like substance, some sodium substance as a preservative in foods. So we have to be thoughtful about where we're getting our sodium. We're going to talk about that in a minute. However, I want to repeat, the American Medical Association recommends 2,300 milligrams of salt daily. However, they say the optimal intake of daily sodium is 1,500 milligrams ever. It is documented that most are eating 3,300 milligrams of sodium every day. 3,300. That's a lot of sodium to have daily. And most sodium is not from the salt shaker that we use. Most of the sodium that we intake from restaurant foods and from packaged foods. So, the recommendation that I want to share with you on how to reduce or manage our sodium intake, one, is to avoid ultra processed foods. Ultra processed foods are those foods that are typically found in cans and in boxes, those foods that are shelf stable. Again, remember, salt is a preservative. And the salt that we consume, when we're reading the labels, that's another recommendation, is to read the labels. Often it just doesn't say salt. It may say MSG or monosodium glutamate, right? It may say sodium nitrate. It may say sodium phosphate. So it's so important that we read food labels so that we can understand, well, it may just say salt, which is great, but there's other ways that food manufacturers are slipping sodium into food products. And knowing that many consumers aren't taking the time to read these labels, or they're using these other terms because perhaps consumers don't understand that monosodium glutamate is also salt. So you may see salt on the label, and you also may see monosodium glutamate, or you may see monosodium glutamate as well as sodium nitrate, right? Two or three sources of sodium in a packaged food. So reading labels and understanding how to look for salt or sodium in our foods is so important. Now, some foods may say low sodium. For example, I think about canned soup. Canned soup has a lot of salt in it, right? But then some may say low sodium, which is good. I mean, it's best to make our own soup. Soup is very easy to make. And if you're somebody who likes soup, you don't need to buy canned soup. We can make our own soup and freeze it for a later use or a later date. However, it's great if they sell low sodium soup, or packaged food companies sell low sodium snacks, right? That's good. However, the consumer has to be careful that while they may reduce the sodium, but they may add more sugar or they may add more fat. So less of one may be in excess of the other. So you want to be careful that you're not trading off low sodium for higher fat or higher sugar content in our foods. So eat a whole food diet, right? Whole foods, meaning, vegetables, fruit, whole foods, not foods that have been pre-packaged and pre-prepared. Like you think about a TV dinner, for example, right? It may have let me think, it may have the chicken, right? The fried chicken. It may have the mashed potatoes. It may have, I don't know, string beans, and it may have a brownie, for example, right? A pre-made, pre-packaged food. And all we have to do is pop it in the oven, or in some cases, some foods, just pop it in the microwave. But think about when you're making chicken or fried chicken or mashed potatoes or green beans and even a brownie, right? When we're making our own foods, then we are choosing how much salt we're adding to the foods. But if we're eating a prepackaged food, then we didn't make that choice. The food manufacturer made that choice for us. The same thing with restaurants. We have to be careful about what we eat in restaurants. Some of the reason why the restaurant food tastes so good is because it has so much salt in it, because it has so much sugar or so much fat in it. There's a reason why Some foods taste so good. And then so often, some of these restaurants are selling us meals that they are not making fresh, right? That are frozen, that are in a bag, and they put that plastic bag in hot water, and then that food shows up on our plates. So sometimes the food, or often the food that's made in restaurants that we eat, it's not made fresh and is preserved using a lot of salt. So we have to be careful about that. But one way to manage that is for us to cook at home and to understand how to add salt to our foods, but more importantly, just eating whole foods, nutritious foods. And sometimes it's not easy for us, sometimes because of where we live or the distance that many of us have to travel. But even still, if we're going to buy frozen vegetables instead of canned vegetables, right? Or if you are buying canned beans and not making your own beans, rinse them because they're packaged with salt added as a preservative. So some of the other foods that we want to avoid that may have a lot of salt are lunch meats. Lunch meats, the turkey, the bologna, the mesquite oven roasted turkey. That stay away from ham. Period. Any kind of pork product, just stay away from that because pork has a lot of salt in it, and it's just horrific for our bodies. Period. It's horrific for our bodies and our minds. And I'll say, if your doctor is any good, your doctor will also tell you to stay off the ham, right? Stop eating bacon. Stop eating foods that are just commonly to have to be found with a lot of salt in it. Your doctor should be telling you this. But if your doctor's not, your sister is. And so I'm here to do that. So dried meats, lunch meats, deli cheeses, these things have a lot of salt in it. So we're going to read our labels. We're going to eat whole foods. We're going to avoid packaged foods to every extent that we can. And then we're also just going to work on stress. Stress contributes so much to high blood pressure. And there are some things that we can do. One, life is going to come with stress. That's just the nature of this. However, how we manage the challenges or the stressors, that makes a big, big difference. And how we accept conflict or challenges, not letting ourselves become too overwhelmed by it, increasing our blood pressure. And so we're going to have stress, but how do we manage it, right? And there's some things that we can do. We can take a walk. Take a 10-minute walk. That will help with our blood pressure. 10 minutes is a good start, but take a 20, 30-minute walk every day. Or if you are stressed or if you are dealing with a challenge, go just walk around the block. And not only will that be good for your body, but that'll also be good for your mind because even that movement can help generate some creativity and problem solving activity. So take a walk. Another way is to do breathing exercises. And there's a breathing exercise that I really enjoy doing. It's 4-7-8, right? So you inhale for 4 seconds. You inhale through your nose. You hold that breath for 7 seconds. And then you exhale through your mouth for 8 seconds, right? So you inhale for 4 seconds. You hold it for 7 seconds. And then you exhale through your mouth for 8 seconds. If you do that a few times, it will make a difference. I've encouraged friends to do it. In fact, if your blood pressure is high, if you take your blood pressure and it's a little elevated, you do that exercise 2 or 3 or 4 times and then take your blood pressure, it'll be lower. Now, be careful doing that because you can become lightheaded if you're not practiced with it. But try that 4-7-8. Try that 2 times. Try that 3 times. Try doing that throughout the day so that we can manage our stressors that commonly occur in life. And some of us experience more stressors. We have more challenges in life than others. So taking those walks and doing those breathing exercises, do some stretching, right? Some people call it yoga. Do some stretching, or count your breaths, even that. Do something that's somewhat meditative that relaxes our minds and that will also relax our bodies. So we're going to avoid ultra-processed foods. We're going to eat a whole food diet. We're going to manage our stress by taking walks and doing some breathing exercises. We're going to read our labels. We're going to manage or moderate how much salt we add to the foods that we cook at home. And we're going to do these breathing exercises. And then just the last thing I'll say is if we're not at a healthy weight, then strive to improve our weight, how much we weigh. And that's something we're going to talk about in a future episode, and knowing our numbers and talking about how weight does impact our health. And weight is more about more than just appearance and looks. There is a factor that is a vanity factor, of course, but weight does contribute. Having an excess weight can contribute to high blood pressure. So, and there's just so much we can do, and you can do your own research. And maybe this episode is a catalyst or it's a kickstart for you to consider what you can do, what your family can do, and how we can help ourselves manage our blood pressure and keep it in a healthy range or get it to a healthy range if it's not. I want to thank you so much for listening to this episode or watching this episode of Nurah Speaks. If you are not subscribed to the YouTube channel, I encourage you to go to subscribe to Nurah Speaks on YouTube. And if you're watching this on YouTube, I also want you to subscribe, like it, leave a comment, a review. This is a service I provide because I love our community and I love our people so much. Thank you so much for listening and watching this episode. Until next time, stay in peace.
We were brought here as a piece of property, and to keep that piece of property, it is to not allow the property to know the value of the property. What I mean by that, if you had known the history of yourself, you would not have been made a slave. And you won't be a slave now if you have a knowledge of yourself. It's hard to enslave a person that have equal knowledge with you. You just can't do it. And so this knowledge of yourself is the thing that will free you from what you have been suffering from.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Nurah Speaks. Look out for a new episode coming at you fresh next week. And if you want to learn more about me and the work that I do, you can visit my website, nurahspeaks.com. Or if you have a listener question, you can email me at nurah@nurahspeaks.com. You can also follow Nurah Speaks on X, Instagram, and Facebook at Nurah Speaks. I will be sure to include links in the show notes. If Nurah Speaks has value to you, please subscribe, rate, and review, and share with family and friends. And be sure to check out previous episodes. And remember, don't just join the movement, be the movement. Stay in peace.